Scorpio and GZDude13 are proud to present the GZDude13 Halloween Special. Enjoy. Number 1.
Bad habits are hard to kill. The highways in the United States go a long way, and my work often requires me to travel these unfamiliar stretches of road through the late hours of the night and the long hours of the day. Doing so has shown me that multiple different and sometimes strange occurrences can happen in even the most desolate of places. My name is Rena, and as strange as you may think it is, I'm a trucker. I haul goods to and from different supply and retail companies that hold a good standing contract with my company's delivery services. To be perfectly honest, I really enjoy this kind of work. This line of employment keeps me busy and moving around enough to try and forget my difficult past and avoid my old bad habits. We all know that bad habits are hard to kill, so it's never a bad idea to keep busy with something new and exciting. And that's exactly what this lifestyle gives me, the opportunity to travel and experience fun new places. However, in early October of this year, I received a delivery kit that took me back into an old town I lived in for a few years. There are a lot of bad memories there, but after looking through the schedule and delivery calendar, I knew that there was no one else available to swap delivery kits with. So I sucked it up and went to go pick up the haul that needed delivered. It was simply labeled antiques, instead of providing a full list of individual items. It didn't matter as long as it all got delivered intact. Long drives can be a blessing to anyone who needs time to calm down or think things through. But this drive was the exact opposite. Images of blood, violence, and torture flooded my mind. It's been over a decade since I ever set foot in that old town. But places don't forget tragedies and horrors like the ones that ultimately led to my decision to flee from that place. Maybe no one would remember. Maybe the town had forgotten about the violence that took place all that time ago. Hopefully, the stories have died down to nothing more than a bad memory in the minds of anyone who still has the will to bring those events back to light. Hopefully, the rumors all died out with the passage of time. 10 years is a long time for anyone. Things change, and so do people. In my case, the change has been both internal and external. Well, mostly external. I doubt anyone would even recognize me with my new appearance. My gray eyes are now a light shade of blue, and my once silvery hair has darkened to a sensual, darker shade of brown. It was late in the evening when my rig pulled up to the only gas pump in town. Lucky for me, it was also right by the local bar. The town was pretty small, with only about 6,000 residents living here, so it was no surprise that this remained the only bar in town. I glanced across the street and saw that the Oleander Family Motel was conveniently still up and running, located right across from the gas station. It was actually a bit surprising to see it still in business after the tragedies that happened there. My haul wasn't due until tomorrow morning, so I figured a quick dip in the old watering hole couldn't hurt. Besides, it was highly unlikely that anyone would recognize me after all this time. What were the odds in running into anyone who would recognize me after 10 years? I stepped through the old saloon-style swinging doors. It wasn't surprising to still see them up after the main entrance. But what was surprising was seeing the bartender from over a decade ago still working the bar. His name was Kendrick Lee Sanders, but most people knew him as the Colonel. He was noticeably older, but still held a very strong resemblance to his younger self. His familiar, stern, and almost angry look in his eyes was more pronounced due to the new wrinkles that developed across his face from the past years. The bigger shock was when I saw the usual seats at the bar and tables were filled just as they had been over a decade ago. Every person was an older and slightly angrier looking version of the people I once called friends. The only explainable and expected difference was instead of 16 usual attendants to the bar, there were only 11. Of course I knew why. The other 5 died 10 years ago. 12 sets of eyes looked over at me as I stood by the entrance. The slow playing country music originating from the jukebox in the background seemed to be the only noise at the moment. The thought of turning around and walking out crossed my mind, but that would be far too suspicious. So I walked over to the center seat at the bar and ordered a beer with a wedge of lemon. The bartender didn't say a word. He just poured me the beer and placed the wedge on the rim of the glass. But then he turned around and went into the back before I could ask him a question. I could still feel the eyes of the patrons scanning me, as if they were trying to learn who I was by just staring at me. The creeping fear that they may recognize me after all began to eat away at my consciousness. The bartender returned and placed a salt shaker down in front of me. After thanking him, I poured salt into my beer and then squeezed the lemon into it. After that, the bar seemed to be satisfied with whatever they were looking for and returned to their own drinks and thoughts. I let out a sigh of relief. It should have been obvious to me. These were regular and simple people. A stranger in their bar will always garner some attention. As I sat there sipping my beer, I couldn't help but notice that the whole bar still looked almost exactly as it had the day I left this dingy little town. The stools were new, the tables looked new, but besides that, everything seemed the same. The old jukebox was the same, though it seemed to have an updated library of music. Looking across the bar, I saw that the colonel still pinned up newspaper articles on the wall. Every article seemed to be something recent or major happening in or around the little town. But then my eyes landed on an old, yellowed article pinned in the middle of all the others. It was partially covered up, but the headline still poked up above the other articles. 13 dead after demonic cult massacre. Yeah, he would still have that article up. But the article was wrong. There was no demonic cult within the town's limits. In small towns like this one, it's difficult to keep a secret that big from everyone else. But it was easy to keep a secret within the collective community. Word travels fast and everyone knows everyone. I finished my beer and left the colonel a $20 bill. After gassing up my rig, I decided to head over to the old Oleander family motel. As expected, the clerk was someone new. I was relieved to see that I didn't recognize the young man at the counter. I checked in under my false name and paid in cash. He reached under the counter and pulled out a key to my room. I glanced behind him and made note that there was a wall box of room keys with blue tags, and wondered why he hadn't handed me one from there. At this point, I was too tired to ask. The key he gave me had a red tag that read, Room 113, in faded black marker. I politely asked if I could get a different room. He looked at me and told me in an almost monotone voice that all the other rooms are full up and that this one was the only one available. I had lived in this town for a good portion of my life and knew that the only time the motel ever filled up was during the annual rodeo in the spring, and as things stood, it was the middle of fall. But again, I was too tired to argue, so I thanked him and pocketed my key. What were the odds of getting the same room I stayed in the night I chose to leave this town? As uncomfortable as it was just for one night. A bed and hot shower were more tempting than sleeping in the cab of my rig anyway. As expected, the room was immaculate and semi-new. The wallpaper looked fairly recent, and the rug was clean, or possibly new, and the bed was lined with fresh sheets. The mattress appeared new, but then again, it would. The massacre the news article on the bar wall talked about did happen in this very room after all. Sleep seemed to be weighing down on my eyelids more than usual, so I skipped the shower and went to bed. Before sleep finally took me, I remembered the colonel had brought me the salt before I could ask for it. The salt. They knew who I was. I fought to stand up, but only succeeded in falling out of bed. Before falling unconscious, I remember thinking that the salt must have been laced with something. I had been drugged. I woke up to the feeling of tingling in my arms. I could hear voices, lots of voices. It sounded like a crowd. When my eyes finally focused, I could see that it was indeed a crowd of people gathered around me. My arms were restrained above my head and my legs were tied together below me. I was strung up nude and tied against a large wooden pole. Heaps of fire was stacked underneath my feet and the pungent smell of gasoline reached my nostrils. Believe it or not, this is actually a familiar scene that has played out a few times in my life. Of course, my life has extended for almost 400 years now. It was foolish to think that 10 years was long enough for the locals to forget about me. The bartender remembered that I liked my beer with lemon and salt. The Oleander family remembered to keep my room vacant, and the town remembered all the innocent people I had killed back when I was a withered old woman. The town priest stood up on the pile of wood and faced the crowd. As it turned out, the townspeople spent the last decade seeking me out after I drained the life of the 13 locals here in town. I knew killing Mrs. Oleander was a mistake, but she had that shade of eyes and brown hair that I wanted. The young man at the counter of the motel turned out to be her son. What a handsome young man he's grown up to be. In fact, he has her eyes. Killing the regular bar patrons was a rash idea, but they had the brute strength I needed. The colonel made sure to remember me for taking away his favorite customers. Slaying the 7 children from the local school was the biggest mistake I could have made. But the blood of the young is what revitalizes me and returns my beautiful youthfulness. The town never forgot about me after I slaughtered their precious children. No wonder they went through all the trouble of finding me and setting up a delivery that would bring me back to this little secluded town. They planned the whole thing and kept it hushed up. Small towns are good at hiding secrets among themselves, after all. The priest jabbered on about witches and the devil while I gauged my situation. This was going to hurt, but it's nothing new. I've been burned before. In the distance, I could see the contents of my hall were being emptied by a few dozen men. I was genuinely surprised to see that the antiques were actually a full collection of ancient fetishes. Someone had done their homework. They had fooled me into bringing a set of old items that could have possibly killed me. They set to work placing the 7-foot-tall wood carvings around me. It was comical to think they would try to use them against me. This was in par with watching children trying to play grown-ups. Some people jeered and screamed religious profanities while others cried, assumingly at the memory of things I had done. I played the part of the distressed witch. I cried and pleaded, telling them they had the wrong person, screaming that I didn't know what they were talking about. It's all for show. I have to make it look like my life was actually in danger. Although I'm not in any way immortal, it is rather difficult to actually kill me. I play the innocent victim card a little bit longer before finally dropping the act and letting out an over-the-top, maniacal laugh. I threw in some old-school satanic chants and made the earth rumble a bit, just for show, and then fell silent when the priest splashed me with gasoline. That was rude. It got in my mouth and everything. The fire was lit, and I screamed until the fire choked the life out of this body. I can say with absolute sincerity that those screams were not an act. They didn't actually kill me, but if it's any consolation to them, that hurt like hell. To be perfectly clear, I have only been burned at the stake as a form of execution twice before this time. Usually, I would be hanged or drowned. But if I've learned anything during the long years I've walked this earth, is that people forget history and become more and more ignorant as the years go by. That's probably why they drove a wooden stake through my breast. If they intended on stabbing my heart, they missed. I woke up nailed inside a wooden box, no doubt 6 feet underground and in a church cemetery. Digging my way out wasn't difficult, and instead of pulling the stake out, I decided on leaving it in. My charred black and red flesh was terrifying all on its own, but the stake added an extra flair to my already awful appearance. It's true that I could have found alternative methods to regenerate my youthful look and repair the damages done to my physical form, but as I stated before, bad habits are hard to kill. With a touch of drama and fear, I collected my ingredients. 5 strong men dragged out of their homes. 1 beautiful person ripped to ribbons behind the front counter, and 7 youths plucked from their beds. No spellbooks or magical items required for this kind of magic. I don't serve the devil, and I didn't sell my soul, but I do call on my familiar, a strong shadow demon who aids me in this kind of thing. Maybe when I'm done here, I'll try becoming a flight attendant. Driving throughout the United States was fun, but I've always wanted to fly abroad.
Number 2.
Calling in sick. I'm writing this down now, because at the moment, I don't really know what to make of it. Hopefully, someone else can figure this mystery out and offer a solution to my problem. Honestly, it started out as more of an inconvenience than a problem, because it didn't really affect my life. But recent developments could mean that I may be in immediate danger. But I should probably start from the beginning. My name is Derek Ken Lee, and I've worked as a security officer for about 20 years now. It's a comfortable job, and honestly, there haven't been many serious incidents that have caused me to ever rethink my line of employment. The worst thing that ever came my way was actually the time I was posted at a graveyard. A bunch of punks from a local cult group would show up several nights a week and have weird seances over people's graves. My security company was hired to run these idiots out and keep an eye out for any further vandalism and trespassing after hours. During one particular foggy night, I managed to interrupt these punks in the middle of one of their Ouija board spook shows as they all scattered like roaches when I screamed at them. When I reached the area they had been sitting at, I saw that they had desecrated one of the much older graves. It was from as early as the 1690s or 1700s. From what I understood, it was a historic grave of a woman that had been relocated to the cemetery. The tombstone read, Bridget Bishop, 1633 to 1692. A dead cat was sprawled over the stone cover with candles and the Ouija board. Further off was an ice chest with beer and liquor. I cleaned up the grave as best I could, but while picking up the Ouija board, something sliced my palm, and I dropped the board. I hadn't seen the ceremonial dagger I assume was used to kill the cat. The cut was deep, and my blood stained the Ouija board and the gravestone. It took 13 stitches to close up the wound. My hand healed up, although I was left with a very visible scar on my palm. As strange as this sounds, I believe that night has led to the problem I find myself in today. You see, after that night, I suffered from vivid and violent nightmares every time I sleep. It didn't matter if it was a catnap or a full night's rest. Once my eyes were closed and my mind dove into the ocean of sleep, I was attacked by the sea monsters that swim in the deepest parts of the unconscious mind. I still remember the first reoccurring nightmare that plagued my rest. For almost 7 weeks, I would dream about a dog running up and clamping down on my arm. However, in the dream, my arms were thin and small, and the dog seemed huge. When it rips into my arm, the scream that comes from my throat isn't my own, but that of a little girl. After weeks of being mauled by a dog, I finally got 2 glorious, dreamless nights. However, after a third restful and dreamless night, I went to a friend's barbecue. Their neighbors had also attended, and they had a young 8-year-old daughter. I'd never met them before, yet the little girl seemed familiar. About an hour later, a stray dog ran up and mauled the little girl right in front of us. It all played out exactly as it had in my nightmare. The only difference was that I had witnessed it from my perspective instead of hers. That night, a new series of nightmares began to haunt my nights, only this time for only 6 weeks. I began to see myself trapped under a heavy wooden beam with flames all around me. My cries for help were in a voice that sounded like a young man. I watched as my legs and then arms caught fire. The nightmare ends when the smell of my own burning flesh mixes with the smoke around me. When I started to have dreamless nights again, I felt relieved. But on the 3rd day after the end of the nightmares, my neighbor's house caught fire. His son was pinned down by one of the collapsed wooden beams. He survived, but suffered a severe spinal injury and 3rd-degree burns on over 70% of his body. After him was the grandfather that tripped and broke his hip, then the car accident toddler, then the young woman that was stabbed by a mugger. Over and over, I saw people getting injured by violent accidents and crimes. But then, my dream started to go from injuries to deaths. Now, people would die from violent attacks, accidents, and freak coincidences. But I also noticed that the time span on how long I suffered from the nightmares was shortening, as if it was a timer for something bigger, something more gruesome. This leads me to today. There's a new nightmare. This one is different and so much worse than any I've had so far. In it, I see myself sitting in the guardhouse, typing out a regular daily activity report on the computer. I know it's me, because it's my workplace, and I can see the scar on the palm of my hand when I reach for my coffee. When I put the coffee mug down, I looked out the window to watch 3 school buses packed with kids pull up to the local racket club across the street. It's not until after the students finish filing into the building that I see a major airliner off in the distance. The plane is spouting smoke from one of its engines, but seconds later, it erupts into flames. The huge mass is now a gliding bombshell, speeding towards the racket club. Even if I were to try to run out the guardhouse or try to hide anywhere, it's obvious that there'll be no escaping the wreckage and fire. Time seems to slow down, and my limbs become heavy and sluggish. Even though I know I won't be able to remove myself from the path of the wreckage, I still try to run. Despite how slowly everything else seems to be moving, the plane appears to be moving entirely too fast. It hits the building nose first and erupts into flames. I know it's impossible, but I somehow hear the screams of hundreds of people and children, all at once, as the building is engulfed by a cloud of smoke, debris, and fire. A plane engine hurls itself out from the smoke in a ball of fire towards me, almost as if it knew I was watching. The very flames and smoke felt like a sentient and evil being that saw me just as much as I saw it. It knew I was watching. It knew I was watching it through the eyes of others. It knew I could see it in my dreams, and it was my turn to suffer its wrath. However, I haven't had this nightmare in the past 2 nights. I think I'll call in sick tomorrow.
Number 3.
The Monsters in the Light. The light is still bright outside, so I have to continue to shield myself from the ever-watching eyes of the ones that wander around while the sun is still up. Let me start from the beginning. Many centuries ago, my ancestors freely wandered the surface of our world, or so I've been told. They labored in their regular day-to-day existences and lived their lives with content. However, they were ignorant to the idea and possibility that something would threaten their way of life. They had grown comfortable with their way of living and never pondered the possibility that it could all be taken away. One day, without warning, a huge alien object crashed onto the surface of our planet and obliterated almost all of the life that once roamed our Earth. Its destructive force was no match for any of our old civilization's modern-day weapons, and even the stargazers failed to see any warning of its arrival. My ancestors were forced to burrow underground and survive off of the minerals of the Earth. Billions of our people died overnight, and the few pockets of survivors were left to fend for themselves. After centuries of suffering, death, disease, and darkness, our surviving generations adapted to our new subterranean lifestyle. Meanwhile, a hell on earth raged over our heads for so long that we have long since lost track of time. As far as we knew, the end of days had come, and we were what was left. My ancestors' world was dead. They abandoned their way of life and lost countless friends, family, and loved ones. The elders in our underground communities still tell the stories passed down to them from their elders and the elders before them from thousands of years ago. We still know of light, but we fear it now, not because it is foreign to us, but because of what lives in it now. Not long ago, explorers have found that the firestorms and ash winters have finally ended, and my generation may very well be the first to return to the surface world. After all these years, after all of these generations, we have finally begun our migration to our now ancient place of origin. back to the surface. But we were met with a grim and terrifying surprise. Our once green and beautiful planet has now been transformed into something ugly and gray, with towering, unnatural structures made of alien materials and strange technology that is beyond our understanding. It was originally believed that the Earth had been obliterated by the huge burning shape that invaded our once quiet planet. But this thought was soon discarded when the first group of explorers also discovered that the surface world was now inhabited by multicolored beings. They are aggressive and fierce-looking creatures that exhibit intelligent traits such as communication and culture. These ugly creatures skulk around with beady eyes and spots of hair adorning parts of their bodies. They communicate with the seemingly loud and aggressive language we still do not understand. We don't understand what they wish to accomplish, but we have observed them from the shadows and have begun to move forward with plans to take back our planet from these invading monsters. Little by little, we're making our way back to the surface, but we have to be careful. Through our many observations, we now know that these creatures cannot function as well in the darkness and must lie in a dormant phase for many hours. We believe they draw their energy from the light and cannot use their underdeveloped eyes where there is no light. We have learned that there are two kinds of creatures, minuscule and energetic beasts that seem to be at the top of the hierarchy, and then there are the much larger and stronger beasts that share the smaller ones' likenesses. However, they function as servants and protectors to the smaller beings. We know that we must destroy the leaders of these beasts in order to take back our world, and so we attack them during their most vulnerable time. We move in to take away their weak and defenseless leaders while they're in their dormant states, trying to hide under feeble forms of camouflage. Some have grown wise of our existence, despite our stealth and cunning. We retreat when the giants rush in to defend the leaders, and we hide from the lights in order to avoid their dark and menacing eyes. I was almost caught yesterday, but I have learned their key phrases and rituals just before the leaders try to enter their state of rest when the light is about to disappear. I heard the warning sounds that told me it was time to hide. The creature mouthed out the sounds that signal my retreat. Daddy, can you check for monsters under my bed?
Number 4.
Paying what's owed. Mr. Darrell P. Vadney was a retired school teacher who loved planting in his garden. His wife, Maggie, would rather spend her afternoons playing bridge with her friends from the bingo hall. But more often than not, you'll find good old Mr. Vadney tending to his garden. After he retired, he and his wife got a great deal on a secluded little house out at the edge of the woods. Along with the house, they also received a fair amount of acreage. The whole property was just far enough out of the way to avoid the hustle and bustle of the busy town, but close enough to still be part of the local county. One of the first projects Mr. Vadney started was his signature garden. He planted everything from vegetables to flowers. The only issue he had was one particular spot behind the house. Despite all of his efforts, he was simply unable to get anything to grow in an 8x14 stretch of rectangular space. Seeing as how Mr. and Mrs. Vadney lived at the edge of the forest and had a total of approximately 10 acres to their name, the one dry and dead patch of earth didn't bother them too much. However, Mr. Vadney had recently fenced off the backyard to keep critters out. Recently, something had been knocking over the trash bins and scratching at the doors and windows at the back of the house, and the last thing Mrs. Vadney needed was to wake up one morning to a raccoon or possum hiding inside one of the breakfast cupboards. So, the fence went up, and the dry dead patch occupied the entire back right corner of the backyard. What an eyesore it was. So for the next few weeks, Mr. Vadney tended to his garden and applied fresh fertilizer, copious amounts of water, compost, and even fresh soil to the dried-up dead earth, only to see it dry up a day or two later. Nothing would grow there, not even the pesky weeds that managed to sprout up between the fence line. This was almost as annoying as the nightly scratching noises at the back door and windows. Come to think of it, the fence was up and the scratching had continued. Critters out by the woods sure were relentless. That very night, the same scratching and scampering sounds could be heard on the back porch, and Mr. Vadney had had about enough of it. He got out of bed and grabbed his old double-barrel shotgun from the closet. He loaded up 2 shells of birdshot and headed out towards the back porch. The moment he flicked on the outside light, the scratching noises stopped. He opened up the door, only to find that there was nothing there. The light must have scared off whatever was making that noise. He was content with that and began to leave the porch light on for the next few weeks. The only problem he failed to remedy during the coming weeks was the dry patch of earth that still refused to yield any kind of life. He tried to contact the realtor who sold him the property, but there was never any answer. This was particularly strange because most of the time he couldn't get the realtor to shut up about how wonderful this property was. Now, Mr. Vadney was questioning why the house and land had sold for such an affordable price. Perhaps there was some kind of chemical spill that prevented anything from growing, or maybe the land was formerly owned by a waste management plant. The house itself seemed to be approximately 100 years old, though it had been remodeled and modernized with the changing times. The frustration of being unable to apply his green thumb to the dead earth was becoming a bother. On top of that, the midnight scratching had resumed, this time at the far west corner of the house where the porch light couldn't reach. Mrs. Vadney had only barely picked up on the sound one night while getting up to get a glass of water. Because the sound wasn't keeping anyone up at night, Mr. Vadney decided to deal with the problematic critter at a later time. It was a rainy morning when Mr. Vadney finally elected to pay a visit to the realtor's office. They had not returned or actually answered any of his calls. It was time to get to the bottom of this and meet with the realtor face to face. It took Mr. Vadney almost 2 hours to get to town due to the heavy rain and muddy trails leading out of his secluded little neck of the woods. He parked his truck and angrily made his way to the main entrance to the realtor's office, only to stop dead in his tracks. Hung on the inside of the plate glass door was a big sign that read, "Space for lease." Underneath the sign was a phone number that matched the realtor's office number. Mr. Vadney wasted no time in dialing the number on the door with his cell phone. A few seconds later, he could hear the line ringing, but simultaneously, he heard a faint ringing off in the distance. Despite the rain coming down, he could hear a phone ringing in sync to the phone call he was making, only it was coming from outside. He followed the source around the building until he discovered an old payphone. It rang in unison to the sound of the ringing on his cell phone. He picked up the payphone off its hook and brought it up to his ear. The echo of his own voice on the line hammered the final nail of confirmation that his calls had been reaching no one the entire time. He went home disappointed, confused, and angry. He had wasted his afternoon and learned nothing new regarding the house's history. That night, the scratching returned, despite the continuous rain. Again, Mr. Vadney loaded up his shotgun, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside. This time, he left the porch light out, intent on killing the annoying critter that continued to disrupt his sleep. He awkwardly held the flashlight in his left hand while holding the shotgun up and gripping the grip with his right. His finger rested lightly on the trigger as he made his way towards the sound of the scratching. The yellow beam of light barely cut through the darkness and illuminated the side of the house. The sound of scratching was getting louder, and Mr. Vadney could feel his heartbeat quicken with the anticipation of finding the animal that was clawing at the side of his house. As he rounded towards the west corner of the house, he was nearly stopped in his tracks by the strong smell of decay. He figured the critter must have dragged something out of the garbage again to feast on it in the dark. As he rounded the corner, he was shocked to see a tall, thin human figure crouching in the darkness with one arm up, scratching at the wall of the house. Vadney shouted at the intruder, now thinking he was dealing with a burglar, and pointed his flashlight and shotgun at the figure. But when Mr. Vadney leveled the light in the direction of his unwelcome guest, he was gone, and the scratching had stopped. He whirled around, expecting to find the intruder sprinting for the fence line, but only found that he was in fact alone in the backyard. He nervously walked around the backyard and checked the fence line, but found no evidence of an intruder. He took one last look at the area where he last saw the figure. He wasn't surprised to find hand and footprints had adorned the fresh mud by the house, and scratch marks were deeply engraved on the wooden wall. About 45 minutes later, Sheriff Cunningham and 2 seasoned deputies arrived to take a statement from Mr. Vadney. During that time, the sheriff seemed distracted and almost distant while inside the house. The 2 deputies talked amongst themselves while inspecting the area around the property. At one point, Mr. Vadney managed to hear one of them say, "I never thought we'd get called back to this house again," to which the other deputy urgently hushed him. After they finished, they urged the Vadneys to keep their doors and windows locked and call back if they saw anything again. 2 days later, Mr. Vadney installed motion-activated lights around his property that frequently flicked on every night, though upon inspection, there was never anyone or anything in sight. For the next following weeks, he also went back into town to visit the library and City Hall to look up public records and seek out the history of his old house. Something wasn't sitting right at the bottom of his stomach, and he felt that the sheriff knew something about the property that he wasn't telling him. The answer came to him in the form of a 7-year-old news article he found in the library's newspaper archives. Family massacred in Steel Beam Mob House. The front page of the newspaper had a clear black and white picture of his house with crime tape surrounding the perimeter. Sheriff Cunningham could be seen standing by the front door speaking to someone. The person wasn't facing the camera, but there was something familiar about him. The article detailed the mysterious deaths of the family. Apparently, the bodies had been so violently beaten that if they had not been found in their respective bedrooms, it would have been a difficult task indeed to properly identify the victims. As far as Vadney could tell, there were no follow-up investigations, no suspects, no names, and no clues. Mr. Vadney next focused his attention on researching the Steel Beam Mob. As expected, they also had a link to the house. The only difference here was that this branch of the Italian mob had met a violent end in the early 1920s. It was believed that the mob boss, Angel Santagata, used the secluded house as a hideout before his capture and execution in 1922. The Steel Beam Mob earned its name by controlling many of the construction businesses in the area at that time. They would often extort money from them and other local businesses in return for protection against other criminals. The mob began to fall apart when Santagata suspected that one of his men was a police mole. Before Santagata was captured, previous newspaper articles implied rumors that he had tortured and killed nearly 45 of his own men by chaining them to steel beams and beating them to death with a sledgehammer in an attempt to flush out the mole. This rumor was made solid when Mr. Vadney found multiple old newspaper articles of broken and disfigured bodies that had been found at construction sites all over town. 13 of Santagata's closest and most trusted associates were never captured, and even after grueling interrogations, Santagata refused to tell authorities where they'd escaped to. The secret died with him when he was finally executed on Tuesday, October 31st, 1922. Santagata's execution had been scheduled for Friday, November 3rd, 1922, but was pushed forward to Tuesday night when he brutally killed 2 prison inmates and painted the walls with their blood. The police, prison guards, and even the prisoners all feared Santagata so much that little argument was made to stop the early execution. His final words while sitting on the electric chair were, "I own this town, and I always get what I'm owed, you hear?" A clear picture of Angel Santagata was presented in the obituaries of a 1922 November newspaper. Mr. Vadney gasped at the sight of the old deceased mob boss. He wasn't a particularly gruesome or ugly man, but he bared a striking resemblance to the realtor who sold him the house. A strange sense of urgency and fear ripped through his spine as he stood up immediately and ran out of the library. The sun had already set, and storm clouds were brewing overhead. He had to get back to the house and get Maggie out of there. He couldn't explain it, but he felt that he had seen something he shouldn't have, and now he and his wife were in danger. He sped through town and called the sheriff as he drove towards the woods. He couldn't explain himself, but he knew that something bad was coming. Something was happening that made no rational sense in his mind, but he knew that the house was dangerous, and it had something to do with its bloody history. Sheriff Cunningham agreed to meet Mr. Vadney at his home, and without further explanation, hung up on him. It took Vadney 45 grueling minutes to finally reach his house. The sheriff's patrol truck was already parked in front, but the lights were all out inside the house. He rushed up to the front door and into the dark house, while the thought of being too late began to fill his mind with panic. His fear was only further fueled when he discovered that the power was out, and thus the house would remain drowned in darkness. A noise from the backyard caught his attention, so he sprinted as quickly as his aching body would allow him. He made it out the back door, only to be met with the butt end of the sheriff's shotgun. An hour later, Mr. Vadney woke up to a swollen black eye, a broken nose, and a splitting headache. The whimpers and cries of his wife made him forget about his pain. He struggled to find her through his blurry vision. When he tried to move, he felt the strain of cold chains holding him down. He was strapped down to a metal beam on the floor, and next to him was his wife with similar restraints. The sheriff stood a few feet away by the back door, still clutching his shotgun. Mr. Vadney struggled to speak and finally managed to ask one question. Why? Sheriff Cunningham averted his gaze from Mr. Vadney and with a tone of sadness said, "Because we all gotta pay our dues." At that moment, a second voice rang out from the darkness, and Angel Santagata stepped out from the darkness of the doorway. "That's right, Cunningham. Everybody's gotta pay their dues." Mr. Vadney remembered the picture on the newspaper article about the family being murdered in the house. The man standing with his back to the camera was Sant'Agata. The sheriff knew about this all along. He knew the house was tainted with evil. Sant'Agata spoke again. "You think you can snoop around my town and start causing trouble for me? I ain't having none of that shit, you hear me? The way I sees it, you owe me good old-fashioned retribution. I own this town, and I always get what I'm owed. Boys, teach these folks how we do things around here." Even from his uncomfortable position on the ground, Mr. Vadney could see movement coming from the dead patch of earth in the far corner of the yard. Twisted, broken bodies began to push their way up from beneath the soil. Sant'Agata's 13 most trusted associates dragged themselves out from beneath the earth. The sheriff leaned his shotgun on the wall behind him and leaned over to pick up a heavy duffel bag. He withdrew 13 sledgehammers and put them down at Mr. and Mrs. Vadney's feet. Each broken and dead mobster managed to stand up on their own impossibly broken legs and grip the handle of a sledgehammer. Sheriff Cunningham picked up his shotgun and started walking away. He knew there was nothing he could do to stop the undead mobsters. He knew the truth about the ghost of Sant'Agata. When a man sheds as much blood and spreads as much fear as Angel did back in 1922, he left behind the limitations of being a human and became the devil himself. He marked his territory with the blood of his own men. Just as Sheriff Cunningham exited out the front door, he heard Mr. and Mrs. Vadney scream just before the sound of a sickening crack as the first hammer came down.
Number 5.
Croatoan Warning. Mary woke up feeling as if the cabin around her had collapsed on top of her. She felt tired and heavy, as if she had labored all day and slept very little. Yet she could not remember the events leading up to her current state. She lifted her head up and realized she was lying on the floor of her cabin. Jacob, her husband, was nowhere to be seen, and there seemed to be no sound coming from outside. While she managed to sit up, she felt her joints crack and the room seemed to spin momentarily. She felt as if she had been lying motionless for days. She felt sick and tired, but there was also a strange tugging feeling of urgency that tugged at her nerves. Something bad had happened, but somehow the details of it had been plucked from her mind. In her heart, though, she felt that something was terribly wrong. The day was cold and gray. The sky was dark and heavy with clouds, and the earth was covered with a light blanket of snow. She could not remember when it started snowing. In fact, she could not remember what day or month it was. She called out and discovered that her throat was dry and sore, as if she had not used her voice in days. No one returned her call, and the settlement remained eerily still. It was a ghost town now, and she seemed to be the only one left standing. She searched her memory again to try to find a reasonable explanation as to what was happening. She remembered that she and just over 100 others had sailed over to Roanoke to join the colony there. When they had arrived on July 22nd, 1587, they discovered the colony was empty except for the skeleton of an unknown colonist. Everyone was afraid and wanted to leave. However, the fleet commander, Simon Fernandez, ordered everyone to stay. His words that day seemed colder and filled with a darker undertone. He refused to listen to reason or heed warnings of anyone else. It had been almost 2 years since that day, yet it felt as if more time had passed. Mary continued to slowly walk through the light snow, feeling her aching joints resisting her every movement. She called out again with the hope of finding someone, anyone, but was only met with silence. She made note that her footprints in the snow were the only ones, but she remained vigilant of any unfamiliar tracks that may belong to another colonist. The wind felt as if it was starting to pick up. A storm was coming, and she was uncertain if she had sufficient supplies to wait out a cold spell. She looked around her and wondered if winter had arrived, and again her memory failed to provide any evidence of her current situation. She searched the small colony and knocked on several doors. As darkness fell and her anxiety rose, she began opening doors without knocking. Every cottage and cabin was empty, yet all of the personal effects of the colonists remained. There was no explanation as to why they would pick up and leave without her, or their few belongings. The day grew dark and cold before she could search every house, and her aching body aided in slowing her efforts. She took shelter in the closest cottage and managed to start a fire. A bit of food she could find was either spoiled or scavenged by rodents, so she settled for a bit of pickled vegetables and dried roots. Sleep did not come easy as the wind moaned and whistled a haunting tune all throughout the night. Through the pounding snow and crying wind, she thought she could hear a voice of someone calling out. Mary strained her ears to hear the voice, but every time she tried, the wind would drown it out, and she dismissed it as a trick of the elements. Despite her fear and discomfort, sleep found Mary, and with it came the nightmares. Vile and monstrous beasts of different shapes and configurations crawled out from the shadows around the small colony and scratched at the windows and doors of the cottage. These were creatures that were beyond her imagining and must have spawned from the pits of hell itself. She heard the voices of the other colonists calling her name and crying in pain from the shadows beyond the cottage in the storm. She woke up with a scream just as a black talon smashed through the front door of the cottage. The storm had died down, and she saw that she remained alone in the small cottage. The wind still made eerie cries off in the distance, and the air carried a colder chill than the previous day. She stood up and saw that the door to the cottage was open, and snow had begun to pile into the cottage. With a spark of fear, she looked down at the falling snow at the door, expecting to find claw marks and footprints. But to her relief, she found nothing. The dream had been a dream and nothing more. She stepped forward to close the door, but stopped when she thought she heard the same voice that had been calling out in the storm. She listened again, and this time she heard the faint cries of a girl. She rushed out into the snow and listened intently past the wind. The cries were weak and muffled, but they were real. This was not a fabrication of her imagination, but the real cries of another soul isolated in the deserted colony. She tried to call out, but the cold air felt as if it had choked the air from her lungs, so she instead focused on what little strength she had left in her efforts to locate the source of the cries. She approached the biggest of the cabins in the colony, the mayor's home. The voice was originating from within that cabin. She flung open the door and stepped inside. No sooner after setting foot inside the cabin, the crying abruptly stopped. The crying had been the loudest here, yet now the cabin fell as silent as death itself. Mary managed to cough out a call and received no answer. She inspected the cabin and searched the only room inside. To her dismay, she found that it was empty. Yet, she felt certain that she had heard the cries of a girl coming from inside. She lit a candle and sat down on a stool by the entrance. Surely she was going mad, for she could not remember what had caused the inhabitants of the colony to flee. Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked down at the dancing shadows the candle cast on the floor. She felt that she would die alone and abandoned, with no memory as to how she had reached the events of this day. As a tear rolled down her cheek, she saw the outline of a square door in the floorboards. She realized with new hope that there was a cellar. Not many of the cottages had a cellar, but the mayor insisted on adding one to his cabin to store excess food and supplies for the colony. With some effort, Mary managed to pry the hatch open to reveal a wooden ladder descending into the darkness. She called out again, and this time her call was answered with the sounds of movement. Without a second thought, she began to step down into the darkness, carefully holding up the candle. She was surprised to find that the cellar dropped down almost 12 feet. When her feet finally found solid earth, she turned around and held the candle out into the darkness. She could smell earth, moisture, mold, and human filth. The candlelight was not bright enough to illuminate the entire darkness, and Mary noticed that she could not see the walls of the cellar other than the wall the ladder was anchored to. It felt as if she had entered into an entire underground cavern. She heard movement again coming from somewhere deeper inside the darkness, and she resolved that she had no other option but to continue. She stepped lightly and walked in the direction of the noises. She was amazed to count almost 78 steps and 13 pillars of stone before she finally came upon a figure in the darkness. It was a thin and dirty girl with her arms held up over her head. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old. Upon closer inspection, Mary could see that the girl was chained up against the wall with clasps around her wrists and a large silver cross mounted on the wall just above her head. She was dirty and disheveled. Her only clothing were rags that barely covered her nudity. Mary was unsure if the poor girl was alive, until the girl's pale eyes opened to reveal nothing but pure whites, as if her eyes were rolled back into her skull. Mary stifled a scream, and then she realized that the girl was blind when she seemed to look past Mary and said, "Hello? Is someone there?" Despite the voice being void of any dark tones, Mary felt a cold shudder pass through her at the sound of the girl's voice. It took her a moment to collect her thoughts and respond. "Yes? My name is Mary. Who put you down here?" The young girl cried out and begged Mary to free her. She cried incoherently and seemed to fight the chains with a renewed strength. A feeling of dread lurched up within Mary, but she fought it down, put the candle on the stone floor, and set to work in pulling the pins that held the chains and clasps secured around the blind girl's wrists. Just as she finished pulling out the final pin, the young girl reached up and wrapped her thin fingers around Mary's throat. Mary began to see visions and memories of what she had forgotten. This was no girl, but an ancient evil that took offense to the arrival of the settlers. It was disrupted by the first foreign settlers, and so it took pleasure in gorging itself on their flesh. A vision of Simon Fernandez encountering this creature in a grotesque and monstrous form appeared in her mind, and she heard him beg for his life. She heard him cry and watched him kneel in fear as the creature drew nearer to him. She heard him make an offer, a sacrifice, 118 lives in return for his own. She heard him offer the demon 90 men, 17 women, and 11 children in exchange for his own life. Mary remembered a blind young girl with pale skin that walked out of the woods asking for help. She remembered how people in the town began to disappear one by one. The mayor had managed to chain her up before she devoured the whole colony, but the restraints only served to restrict her influence and powers. She still had the small settlement under her spell. The last thing that passed through Mary's mind as she watched the creature rip its way out of the fleshy disguise of the little girl was the Croatoan native Indians' warning to them of the spirit of the island. They warn the settlers not to take from the land without offering a tribute in return.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to check out the original content that helped make this video possible. Links are in the description below. Don't forget to check out GZDude13's channel for the second half of this Halloween special. We'll see you there.